My name is Grace. I never imagined I would begin my story this way. I am not a criminal. I have never broken the law. And yet, one morning, I was arrested for crimes committed using my identity. It happened on a day that felt completely ordinary. The kind of day where nothing warns you that your life is about to split into a before and an after. I was standing in my kitchen, waiting for the kettle to boil. The window was open just a little, letting in cool air and the distant sound of traffic. I remember thinking about groceries. About whether my knees would behave if I went for a walk later. Small, unimportant thoughts. Then there was a knock at the door. Not loud. Not aggressive. Just firm and certain. I opened the door without hesitation. 2 police officers stood there. Their posture was professional, their faces serious but controlled. One of them asked my name. Grace Thompson, I said. He checked a paper in his hand, then looked back at me. We need you to come with us. I smiled, confused. I truly thought there had been some mistake. I even stepped aside, expecting them to say sorry and move on to the next house. Instead, they asked for my identification. That was the moment my body reacted before my mind did. My heart didn't race, it sank. I handed over my ID, still believing this would end quickly. They studied it carefully. You are under arrest, one of them said, for fraud and financial crimes. I remember blinking, certain I had misheard. For what? I asked. They began listing things I had never done. Bank accounts I had never opened. Loans I had never applied for. Transactions I had never seen. It felt unreal, like listening to someone describe another woman's life while using my name. When they placed the handcuffs on my wrists, they did it gently. That gentleness hurt more than force ever could. It meant they believed the paperwork. Neighbors watched as I was led to the car. Some stared openly. One woman I had shared tea with looked away. I wanted to explain. I wanted to shout that this wasn't me. But no one asks for explanations in moments like that. Inside the police car, the city moved on as if nothing had happened. Shops opened. People crossed streets. Buses stopped and started. My life, however, had come to a sudden halt. At the station, they took my fingerprints. My photograph. They asked questions I could not answer. Did you authorize this account? No. Did you sign these documents? No. Each answer sounded weaker than the last. One officer said something I would carry with me for a long time. On paper, you did this. On paper. That night, sitting alone, I finally understood how dangerous it is when your identity stops belonging to you. And I had no idea yet how long it would take to get it back. They kept me overnight. Not because they were cruel, but because the system had already decided who I was before I ever opened my mouth. The cell was small and cold. The bench was hard. I sat there with my hands folded, staring at the wall, trying to understand how an ordinary life could collapse so quickly. Every sound echoed. Every minute stretched longer than the last. I replayed my life in my head like evidence. Every job I had worked honestly. Every bill I had paid on time. Every rule I had followed without question. I searched for the moment where I had done something wrong, and found nothing. A young officer brought me water later. He avoided my eyes at first, then finally looked at me and said quietly, "This happens more often than people think." That sentence frightened me more than the arrest. If this could happen often, then safety was thinner than I had ever believed. The next day, I was told I would be contacted. One officer tried to comfort me. "If you're innocent, it'll be sorted out." Sorted out. As if my life were a misplaced file. Walking home felt unreal. The street looked the same. My house stood exactly where it always had. But when I stepped inside, the silence felt accusing. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at my phone for a long time. I wanted to call someone. But how do you explain this without sounding unbelievable? I finally called my sister. She listened quietly as I told her everything. When I finished, there was a pause long enough to hurt. "Grace," she said carefully, "are you sure?" That question cut deeper than the handcuffs. In that moment, I realized something painful. Innocence alone is not enough once doubt enters the room. The letters started arriving within days. Banks, credit agencies, legal notices. Each envelope felt heavier than the last. Accounts I had never opened. Debts I had never created. Addresses I had never lived at. Someone had built an entire financial life using my name. And I was expected to answer for it. That was when the fear truly set in, not of prison, but of being erased by paperwork. Fear changes shape when it settles in. At first, it is loud and sharp. Then, slowly, it becomes quiet and heavy. I stopped sleeping properly. Nights were the worst. My mind replayed conversations, imagined future accusations, built scenarios I could not escape. Every time a car slowed outside my house, my chest tightened. Every knock, even from the postman, made my hands shake. I began to collect evidence of my own life. That sounds strange, I know. But suddenly, everything needed proof. Old bank statements, utility bills, medical appointments, receipts from small shops I had visited for years. I filled a folder, then another. My entire existence reduced to documents. I carried that folder everywhere. At the bank, the manager listened politely, but his eyes stayed on the screen more than on me. "According to our records," he said, "these accounts were opened by you." "I don't even know how to open an online account," I replied. "I still write most things down." He sighed, not unkindly, just tired. "That's what most people say." That sentence followed me everywhere. I went from office to office, repeating the same story until it felt rehearsed. Each time, I watched people decide whether I was worth believing. Some were sympathetic. Others were cautious. A few were openly suspicious. And slowly, something else crept in. Shame. Not because I had done anything wrong, but because I was being treated like someone who had. I stopped meeting friends. I avoided conversations. Explaining myself felt exhausting. I could see the unspoken question behind their eyes. What if it's true? One afternoon, after a particularly long call with a debt collector, I sat at the table and cried until my head hurt. Not loud sobs. Quiet ones. The kind you make when you're trying not to fall apart. I asked myself questions I never should have had to ask. Had I been careless? Had I trusted someone too easily? Was this somehow my fault? That was the most dangerous thought of all. Because once you start blaming yourself for something you didn't do, you begin to shrink. And I could feel myself shrinking. But somewhere beneath the fear and exhaustion, something else was forming. A small, stubborn voice that refused to disappear. It said, "This is not your crime. This is not your shame." I didn't know yet how to fight back. But I knew I could not disappear quietly. The first real step toward fighting back was admitting that I couldn't do it alone. For weeks, I had tried to handle everything myself. I thought if I stayed calm, explained clearly, and showed enough proof, the truth would rise on its own. But truth does not move unless someone pushes it. So I found a lawyer. His office was small, above a grocery store, with stairs that creaked as I climbed them. The waiting room smelled faintly of old paper and coffee. It felt human. That mattered. He didn't interrupt as I spoke. He didn't rush me. He listened the way people used to listen, fully. When I finished, he said, "What you're describing is identity theft. And once it starts, it spreads quickly." That sentence made everything suddenly feel real. This had a name, a structure, an explanation. He told me what to expect. Reports. Affidavits. Disputes. Time. A lot of time. I nodded, even though patience was something I had already spent. We began with formal reports. Writing down my story again, this time in exact dates and facts. My hand cramped as I wrote, but I didn't stop. Each line felt like a piece of myself I was reclaiming. Then came the phone calls. Long waits. Recorded messages. Voices that treated me like a case number instead of a person. One woman said, "Until this is resolved, you remain responsible for the debt." I asked her quietly, "Responsible for what?" "For the accounts in your name." After that call, I sat in silence for a long time. I looked around my modest home, furniture I had owned for years, photographs of people who trusted me, a life built carefully and slowly. I had never lived beyond my means. And now I owed money I had never touched. That night, I dreamed I was standing in a long line, holding my identification, while people ahead of me were waved through easily. When it was my turn, someone shook their head and sent me back to the end. I woke up tired. But something inside me had shifted. I was no longer asking for understanding. I was preparing for endurance. Endurance is not dramatic. It is quiet, repetitive, and deeply tiring. Days began to follow the same pattern. I woke early, even when I hadn't slept well. I made tea, opened my folder, and chose one task for the day. Only one. I learned quickly that trying to fix everything at once only led to exhaustion. Some days, that task was a phone call. Other days, it was filling out a form or writing another statement. And some days, the task was simply getting through the day without breaking down. The lawyer warned me about this phase. "This is when people give up," he said. "Not because they're wrong, but because they're tired." I understood exactly what he meant. Each conversation required me to explain myself again from the beginning. I learned to keep my voice steady even when I felt small. I learned to repeat facts without sounding defensive. I learned to sit with long silences while someone on the other end of the line decided what they thought of me. There were moments when I wanted to shout, "Check the records properly. Look at me." But shouting never helped. Calm did. I started writing everything down. Names. Dates. Reference numbers. Promises made and promises broken. The notebook beside my phone became as important as my ID. And slowly, painfully slowly, small things began to change. One bank froze an account. Another marked a charge as under review. A creditor agreed to pause collection until the investigation progressed. None of it felt like victory, but it felt like movement. Still, the waiting weighed heavily. Weeks passed. Then months. Life continued around me, but I felt stuck in the same moment, repeating the same explanations. Friends asked how things were going. I learned to answer carefully. "It's ongoing," I said. "I'm handling it." Some nodded and changed the subject. Others leaned in, curious in a way that made me uncomfortable. I began choosing silence more often than words. At night, alone with my thoughts, fear sometimes returned. Not fear of guilt, but fear of never being fully believed. Fear that my name would always carry a question mark. But every morning, I got up again. That became my quiet rebellion. I didn't disappear. I didn't give up. I stayed. And slowly, that persistence began to matter. Persistence has a strange way of changing how people see you. At first, I was just another voice on the phone. Another file on a desk. Another problem to be managed. But as weeks turned into months, my name became familiar in certain offices. Not famous, just known. "Oh, yes, Mrs. Thompson," someone would say. "I remember your case." That mattered more than I expected. It meant I was no longer invisible. The detective assigned to my situation began calling with updates, not often, but regularly enough to remind me that things were moving, even when I couldn't see how. He spoke more carefully now, choosing his words with intention. They had noticed patterns. Similar accounts. Similar methods. People my age. People who lived quietly and trusted easily. I was not alone. That realization brought mixed emotions. Relief, because I was no longer isolated. Sadness, because others were suffering the same confusion and fear I knew too well. I was asked to give a formal statement again, this time not as someone under suspicion, but as a victim. Sitting in that room felt different. The questions were different. The tone had changed. They wanted to understand how someone like me had been targeted. I spoke honestly. About my routines. About how rarely I used technology. About the paperwork I trusted others to handle. About how I never imagined my name could be used as a weapon against me. When I finished, one of them nodded and said, "That helps." 2 simple words. But they carried weight. Outside, the air felt lighter. I stood on the steps for a moment longer than necessary, breathing deeply. For the first time since my arrest, I felt like the world had shifted slightly in my favor. At home, I noticed something else had changed. I was no longer afraid of my own mail. That may sound small, but it wasn't. It meant my body was beginning to believe what my mind already knew, that I was fighting back, and that the fight was no longer one-sided. I still didn't know how this would end. There were no guarantees. No promises of quick resolution. But for the first time, I felt something close to confidence. Not the loud kind. The quiet kind that grows when you refuse to disappear. Confidence does not remove uncertainty. It simply gives you something steady to stand on while uncertainty does its worst. There were still days when progress felt invisible. Days when no calls came. No letters arrived. Days when silence felt heavier than bad news. I learned that silence often meant work was happening somewhere else, beyond my reach. I tried to live inside that understanding. I returned to small habits I had abandoned. A short walk in the morning. Cooking simple meals instead of skipping them. Watering my plants, even the one I had almost given up on. Caring for something living reminded me that neglect happens quietly, and so does recovery. But trust was slow to return. I read every line of every document as if it might betray me. I checked my bank balance more often than necessary. I kept my folder close, even when I didn't need it. I blamed myself less, but the habit hadn't disappeared entirely. Late at night, old questions still appeared. What if I had noticed sooner? What if I had been more careful? I had to remind myself again and again, vigilance does not prevent cruelty. It only responds to it. One afternoon, while sorting old papers, I found something that made my hands stop. An application form from years earlier. A place I had volunteered for briefly. My details written clearly. Copies made. Stored. I stared at it for a long time. I would never know if that was where it began. And that realization brought a strange kind of peace. Because chasing every possible what if would keep me trapped forever. Some answers never arrive. Acceptance does not mean forgetting. It means choosing where your energy goes. As months passed, conversations with officials changed again. They spoke of suspects now. Of linked cases. Of arrests elsewhere. Nothing definite, but enough to know I was no longer the focus. I noticed how differently they addressed me. My name said without hesitation. My story summarized accurately. Small signs of respect that felt larger than they should have. I had moved from being doubted to being understood. And with that shift, something inside me softened. Not weakness. Relief. Relief does not arrive like celebration. It settles in quietly, almost shyly, as if unsure whether it is allowed to stay. I began to notice it in my body first. My shoulders no longer stayed tense all day. My jaw stopped aching from being clenched without realizing it. I could sit through an afternoon without that constant sense of waiting for something bad to happen. The investigation moved forward without me at the center of it anymore. That alone changed how the days felt. I was still involved, still available when needed, but no longer under a shadow. Then one afternoon, my lawyer called with a different tone in his voice. "They're preparing formal clearance on several charges connected to your name," he said. Formal clearance. I asked him to repeat it. Not because I didn't hear, but because I needed to feel the words settle properly. It wasn't complete yet. Some institutions would take longer than others. Some records would need correction one by one. But legally, officially, I was no longer considered responsible for the crimes attached to my identity. When I hung up, I didn't cry. I sat very still. It felt wrong to rush such a moment. Weeks later, the letter arrived. Plain paper. Official language. No emotion in it at all. It stated that I was not liable for the fraudulent actions previously attributed to me. Not guilty. I read it slowly. Then I read it again. Then I folded it carefully and placed it in my folder, not at the top, but in the middle, where it belonged. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in months. But the next morning, I realized something important. Being cleared on paper does not instantly restore trust, especially your own. I still hesitated before signing anything. I still read everything twice. The world felt safer, but not harmless. And that was okay. I had learned that safety is not blindness. It is awareness without fear. The days after clearance were strangely quiet. For so long, my life had been filled with calls, letters, explanations, and waiting. When all of that slowed down, it felt like stepping into a room where the noise had suddenly stopped. At first, the silence felt uncomfortable, even suspicious. I kept expecting the phone to ring. It didn't. People around me assumed I would be celebrating. Some said, "At least it's over now," as if the story had reached a neat ending. I nodded politely, but inside I knew better. It wasn't over. It had simply changed shape. The fear of being arrested again faded, but a deeper caution remained. I still checked my credit regularly. I still kept copies of everything. I still moved through official spaces with careful attention. Freedom, I realized, comes with memory. One evening, I sat alone with a cup of tea and thought about the woman I had been before all this happened. She believed that honesty was enough. That rules protected you. That if you did nothing wrong could happen to you. I missed her innocence. But I didn't want her back. Because she didn't know what I knew now. I had not lost my kindness. I had gained awareness. Weeks later, I received a call informing me that arrests had been made in connection with the fraud ring. Names I didn't recognize. Faces I would never see. The information brought no satisfaction, only closure. I did not need revenge. I needed peace. And slowly, peace returned. Not all at once. Not dramatically. In small, steady moments. I laughed without forcing it. I slept without fear waking me in the middle of the night. I trusted again, carefully, thoughtfully, but sincerely. This experience had not destroyed me. It had reshaped me. Reshaped does not mean hardened. That was something I worried about for a long time. I was afraid that what I had gone through would make me suspicious of everyone, closed off from the world. But that didn't happen. Instead, I became more intentional. I listened more carefully. I trusted more wisely. There is a difference. I began to notice how often I had once apologized for existing, for asking questions, for needing time. During the investigation, those habits had nearly swallowed me. Now, I refused to shrink. If something was unclear, I asked. If something felt rushed, I slowed it down. If someone spoke to me with impatience, I stayed calm and steady. Not to prove anything, but because I no longer needed approval to stand my ground. One afternoon, standing in line at the bank, I watched a woman ahead of me struggle to explain something. Her voice trembled the way mine once had. The clerk spoke quickly, barely looking up. Without thinking much, I said gently, "Could you please explain that again, a little more slowly?" The clerk paused, then nodded. The woman looked back at me, surprised. She smiled, small and grateful. It was such a simple moment. But it stayed with me. I realized then that surviving something difficult doesn't always turn you inward. Sometimes, it quietly teaches you how to stand beside others. At home that evening, I thought about how close I had come to disappearing during those months. How easily I could have given up, convinced myself that fighting wasn't worth the cost. I was glad I hadn't. Not because the ending was perfect, but because I had learned something about myself that no peaceful life ever teaches you. I was capable of endurance. I was capable of clarity. I was capable of beginning again. And that knowledge felt like a kind of freedom I had never known before. Beginning again does not mean forgetting where you came from. It means carrying the past without letting it lead. I started to notice how my days felt fuller, not because more was happening, but because I was present in them again. I tasted my food. I noticed the weather. I listened when people spoke, instead of preparing explanations in my head. For months, my mind had lived in defense mode. Every thought had been about proving, protecting, correcting. Letting go of that constant readiness took time. Even peace required practice. There were moments when old memories surfaced without warning. A sudden flash of the cell door closing. The sound of keys. The word arrest spoken calmly, as if it were nothing. When that happened, I didn't push the memory away. I let it pass through me. I had learned that resisting pain gives it strength. Acknowledging it lets it soften. I also learned something unexpected about forgiveness. Not forgiveness for the people who used my identity, that was not my work to do. But forgiveness for myself. For not knowing. For trusting. For being unprepared in a world that often punishes the gentle. I stopped asking myself why this had happened to me. That question had no answer that could heal me. Instead, I asked something else. What kind of life do I want now? The answer was simple. A quiet one. An honest one. A life where fear does not make decisions for me. So I chose that life, one small decision at a time. I said no more often. I rested without guilt. I allowed joy without suspicion. And slowly, the version of me shaped by crisis began to relax into something steadier. Not weaker. Wiser. Wisdom, I discovered, is quieter than confidence. It doesn't rush to prove itself. I stopped talking about the case unless there was a reason. Not because I was hiding it, but because it no longer needed to sit at the center of my life. It had taken enough time already. There were days I forgot about it entirely, and when I noticed that, I smiled. Healing had slipped in without asking permission. I began sorting my home more carefully. Old papers were shredded. Important documents were locked away. I learned small things about protecting myself, slowly, patiently, without shame. Learning late is still learning. One afternoon, my sister visited. We sat together in the living room, sunlight falling across the floor the same way it always had. She looked at me for a long moment and said, "You're different." "I know," I replied. "Calmer," she added. That felt right. Not because life was perfect, but because I trusted myself again. I trusted my ability to handle whatever came next. That evening, I wrote in my notebook for the first time in a long while. Not notes or evidence, just reflections. I wrote about how identity is more than numbers and records. how it lives in choices, in values, in how you treat others when you're afraid. I wrote about how easily a name can be misused. Closing the notebook, I felt something settle inside me. This chapter was no longer open. It was becoming something I could place gently on a shelf, knowing it had changed me, but no longer controlled me. Letting go did not happen all at once. It happened in quiet moments I didn't plan. One morning, I realized I had walked past the police station without my chest tightening. The thought surprised me so much that I stopped for a second, just to be sure. The building was the same. The doors were the same. But my body no longer reacted. That was when I understood something important. Healing shows itself first in places you used to fear. I no longer jumped at official-looking envelopes. I opened them calmly, read them once, and moved on. I no longer felt the urge to explain myself to strangers, or to justify my past before it was even questioned. I trusted my own truth now. There were moments of reflection that still came late at night. Not with pain, but with clarity. I thought about how close I had come to losing myself to fear. How easily a person can disappear when the world doubts them long enough. I promised myself something then. I would never measure my worth by how convincingly I could defend it. My life became simpler. Not smaller, simpler. I chose peace over proving. Presence over perfection. I allowed myself to enjoy ordinary things again without guilt. A warm cup of tea. A quiet afternoon. A laugh that came easily. I understood now that surviving something unjust does not make you bitter by default. It gives you a choice. And I chose softness, with boundaries. I chose to live without constantly looking over my shoulder. Not because nothing bad could happen again, but because I knew I could face it if it did. Softness with boundaries is a balance you learn only after it has been broken. Before all this, I thought being careful meant being closed. Now I understood that care could exist without fear living at its center. I could stay open to people while staying protective of myself. That distinction changed everything. I began saying no without explaining myself. Not out of anger, not to punish anyone, but because my energy was no longer unlimited. I had spent too much of it trying to convince the world of something that was already true. There were times when people asked me to recount what had happened, expecting a dramatic story. I could see it in their eyes, curiosity dressed up as concern. Sometimes I told them. Sometimes I didn't. And for the first time in my life, I felt no guilt about that choice. My story belonged to me. One quiet afternoon, I was cleaning out a drawer when I found my old folder, the thick one that had followed me everywhere. It was worn now, the corners bent, the pages inside marked with notes and dates and signatures. I sat down and opened it. For a moment, I felt that old heaviness return. The long months of waiting. The disbelief. The feeling of being watched by systems that did not know my face. Then I closed the folder. I didn't throw it away. I didn't destroy it. I placed it carefully in a box and stored it out of sight. Not as something to hide, but as something that no longer needed daily attention. That evening, I cooked a proper meal for myself. Nothing fancy. Just warm, familiar food. I ate slowly, without distraction, without my mind drifting to paperwork or deadlines. I realized then how long it had been since I had done something simply because it felt grounding. Survival had taken up all the space for too long. Now, life was gently returning to that space. Life returning does not arrive with an announcement. It slips back in when you're not watching for it. I noticed it one morning while standing at the window, waiting for the kettle to boil. The light came through the glass just as it always had. Cars passed. Someone laughed outside. And for the first time in a long while, my mind wasn't racing ahead or back. I was simply there. That ordinary moment felt like a quiet victory. I thought about how much of my energy had once been spent bracing myself, for questions, for doubt, for accusations that might return without warning. Letting go of that constant readiness took practice. Some days I succeeded. Some days I didn't. And that was all right. I stopped expecting myself to be over it. Healing doesn't follow schedules. It loosens its grip slowly, when it knows you're safe enough to carry the memory without being crushed by it. There were still things I did differently now. I checked details more carefully. I trusted my instincts sooner. I protected my time and my peace with intention. Those changes didn't make me fearful. They made me grounded. One afternoon, a neighbor I hadn't spoken to since the arrest stopped me outside. She looked uncomfortable, unsure of how to begin. "I heard that everything was cleared," she said. "Yes," I replied. She nodded, then said, "I'm glad." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an explanation. But it was enough. I didn't need everyone to understand what I had lived through. I needed to understand it myself. And I finally did. What happened to me was unjust. How I survived it was deliberate. That distinction mattered. I went back inside, closed the door gently, and felt something settle that I hadn't felt in a long time. Completion. Not because nothing bad could ever happen again, but because this chapter, the one that began with a knock on the door, no longer needed my constant attention. It had taught me what it came to teach, and I was ready to keep living. Keeping on living turned out to be the bravest part of all. After everything I had endured, I expected life to feel fragile, like glass that might crack if handled carelessly. Instead, it felt sturdier than before. Not because the world had softened, but because I no longer mistook calm for weakness. I learned to trust my rhythm again. Some days were full and social. Others were quiet and inward. I stopped judging either. I let myself be human instead of resilient all the time. There were moments when people praised my strength, calling me brave, inspiring. I thanked them, but inside I knew the truth was simpler. I hadn't been brave in a heroic way. I had been stubborn in an ordinary way. I refused to let someone else's crime write the ending of my story. I thought often about how easily things could have gone differently. How many people lose years trying to prove what should never have been questioned? How many don't have the energy, the support, or the time to fight back the way I did? That thought made me gentler with others, especially those caught in systems that don't pause to see faces. If there is anything I carry forward now, it is this. Listen carefully before you judge. Believe people sooner than paperwork does. And never assume that silence means guilt. Because sometimes, silence just means someone is tired of explaining their innocence. I still live in the same house. I still make tea the same way. I still walk the same streets. From the outside, my life looks unchanged. But inside, everything is different. I know who I am, not because records say so, but because I lived through doubt and did not lose myself in it. I was arrested for a crime committed using my identity. But my identity was never the crime. It was the strength that carried me through it. And that is the truth I live with now, quietly, fully, and without fear. There is a moment, after everything ends, when you realize you are no longer waiting. 4 months, waiting had been my natural state. Waiting for calls. Waiting for letters. Waiting for decisions made by people who had never met me. Even after the case was cleared, part of me stayed alert, as if the waiting might return without warning. One afternoon, sitting quietly with a book, I noticed something unusual. I wasn't listening for the phone. That small realization brought a gentle smile to my face. It meant my body had finally accepted what my mind already knew, that the danger had passed. I thought about how much fear had shaped my days during that time. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of being judged. Fear of losing everything I had built simply because someone else chose to misuse my name. And I realized that fear had taken up space where life should have been. Now that space was open again. I filled it with simple things. Conversations that didn't need explanations. Evenings that ended peacefully. Plans made without backup plans for disaster. I allowed myself to imagine the future again. Not in big, dramatic ways, but gently. A trip I had postponed. Admitting myself to a class I once thought I was too old for. Small joys that required trust. Sometimes, when I think back to the arrest, I no longer feel pain. I feel distance. Not because it didn't matter, but because it no longer defines me. That experience became a line in my history, not the headline of my life. And that, I think, is how healing truly shows itself. Distance brings perspective, and perspective brings choice. I began choosing what I wanted my days to feel like. Not perfect. Not impressive. Just honest and calm. I stopped measuring myself against who I used to be and started respecting who I had become. There were still reminders now and then. A form that asked for past legal issues. A background check that took a little longer than expected. Each time, I felt a flicker of the old frustration, and then it passed. I answered truthfully. I explained when needed. And I moved on. I no longer carried my story like a defense. I carried it like experience. One afternoon, while sorting through old belongings, I found a notebook from the early days, the one where I had written names, dates, reference numbers. I flipped through it slowly. The handwriting was tense at first, rushed, uneven. Toward the end, it grew calmer, more spaced, more confident. I closed the notebook and realized something simple and important. I had changed, and that was not a loss. Change did not erase who I was. It refined me. I had learned how fragile systems can be, and how strong people must sometimes become to survive them. I had learned that truth does not always speak the loudest, but it lasts. Most of all, I had learned to stand by myself when the world hesitated. That knowledge stayed with me, steady and quiet. I didn't need justice to feel whole anymore. I didn't need validation to feel real. I had my life back, not the untouched version, but the honest one. And that was enough. There is a peace that comes when you stop asking the past to explain itself. For a long time, I believed that understanding why this happened would somehow complete the story. That if I knew the exact moment my identity was taken, or the exact person who used it, something inside me would finally settle. But life rarely offers that kind of clarity. What it offered instead was something quieter, acceptance without answers. I stopped replaying old moments, searching for the mistake that wasn't mine. I stopped imagining conversations I would never have. I stopped needing the story to make perfect sense. And when I did, the weight lifted a little more. One evening, as I prepared for bed, revealed something small but meaningful. I no longer checked the locks twice. I no longer scanned the room for threats that weren't there. My body had relearned safety. That felt like healing. I understood now that justice, when it comes, does not always arrive with balance. It does not return time. It does not erase memory. It simply draws a line and says, this is where the harm ends. Everything after that is up to you. So I chose to live forward. I chose not to introduce myself through what had happened. I chose not to let fear narrate my days. I chose to remain kind without being careless, open without being unprotected. There is a difference, and I know it now. If someone listening to my story is carrying a similar weight, I want them to understand this. You are not weak for being shaken. You are not foolish for trusting. And you are not broken because something unjust happened to you. Sometimes, the bravest thing you do is refuse to let someone else's actions decide who you become. I was arrested for a crime committed using my identity. But I reclaimed my life, slowly, deliberately, and fully. And that is how my story continues. My story does not end with sirens or courtrooms. It ends quietly, the way most real lives do. These days, my mornings are simple. I wake up without fear pressing on my chest. I make tea and let it cool the way I like. I look out of the window and think about the day ahead, not about what might come crashing into it. That peace did not come easily. It was earned, slowly, painfully, and honestly. When I look back now, I don't see myself as a victim anymore. I see myself as someone who was tested in a way she never deserved, and who survived without losing her values. I did not become bitter. I did not become cruel. And most importantly, I did not become silent. I learned that systems can fail people. I learned that paperwork can lie louder than truth. And I learned that dignity is something you must sometimes protect with your own hands. If you are listening to this and carrying your own quiet battle, one where you feel misunderstood, accused, or erased, I want you to hear this clearly. Your truth matters, even when it is questioned. Your life has value, even when systems don't see it. And you are stronger than the moment trying to define you. I was arrested for a crime committed using my identity. But my identity was never the crime. It was my patience, my resilience, my refusal to disappear. And today, I live not as someone who was once accused, but as someone who knows exactly who she is. That is how I survived. That is how I healed. And that is the life I continue to live, calmly, honestly, and without fear. Sometimes, after a story feels finished, life adds a quiet sentence at the end. Months after everything had settled, I received a letter that wasn't official, wasn't urgent, and wasn't heavy. It was from a woman I had spoken to briefly during the investigation. We had shared a room, a table, a few careful words. She wrote to say she was finally sleeping again. That sentence stayed with me. It reminded me that stories don't end when the paperwork does. They end when the body feels safe enough to rest. I thought about how many people carry invisible versions of what I carried, not always arrests or accusations, but moments where the world decides something about them that isn't true. Moments where their voice feels too small to correct the record. I used to think survival meant standing tall at the end, victorious and unshaken. Now I know better. Survival often looks like softness returning, like laughter that surprises you, like peace that no longer needs explanation. I don't tell my story often anymore, but when I do, I tell it the same way I lived it, calmly, without exaggeration, without apology. Because my life is no longer a defense. It is simply mine. And if there is one final truth I carry forward, it is this. No one gets to decide who you are based on a moment taken out of context. No system gets to own your name. And no injustice, no matter how loud, has the right to erase your quiet strength. I was arrested for a crime committed using my identity. But my identity survived. And so did I.